Hello, welcome back. I'm with Tuan Andrew Nguyen and Hotsun Nyen. So just before we start, Tuan tells me a story which I'm going to embellish and make into a joke. So we have a mutual friend, David Tay, who's an art historian, and so let me caricature David as this overly serious academic, right? Since he's not here, we can make fun of him. So David, catches up with Tuan in Vietnam, and he says, "Tuan, tell me about Southeast Asia. Does it make any sense to you?" And you can imagine, the expression on his face. Well, today we do sort of end with this session thinking a little bit about Southeast Asia as a region and how it doesn't make sense, or can. Now, we'll start with Hotsun Nyen, and there's this sort of metaphor of resonance that I think you employ as a way of connecting not only diverse communities, but perhaps even disparate ones. Resonance is sort of, one can think about the doubling that happens in resonances, and then some. So from the double, you kind of sometimes get oppositions. So you have the resonant, and then you also get a bit of the counter. And so our topic on counter-memory and the doubling of its recall, resonance, counter-memory, counter-narrative. One of these sounds that resonates a lot throughout Southeast Asia, and we had the gong today with Kidlat. We had it with Kidlat, is the gong, right? A pivotal symbol of the resonant throughout the region. In some kind of tension, you have Tuan, who also listens very, very closely to near-erased histories of an Indochina via Vietnamese long-lost migrants who reimagine how Senegal became home. In the history of empire, one of the fundamental relations is a non-relation, the lack of solidarity from the communities that were forced together by empire. It is as if this juxtapositions of the two projects create this kind of compelling image of the resonant and the dissonant. So Nyen sort of is the resonant and Tuan the dissonant. So I'm going to hand over to Zhu.
Hello. I'm going to jump right in. So before I start, I'd just like to give a very quick give you some information on the context of this project. So the project that I'm presenting here comes out of this longer-term project that I've been working on called the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia. I just wanted to show this. This is actually a website. And on this website, what you will see is an ongoing film that is edited by algorithms. The materials for this algorithmically edited film is ingested from YouTube and Vimeo sources. So we created a platform that ingests these online clips, and there is an algorithm that constantly rearranges these clips according to 26 terms, one for each letter of the alphabet. So this is kind of the meta project, I guess. And the project that I'm presenting here at Sharjah comes out from the term resonance under R. So if you have time or interest, do check it out. The address is below. So what is Southeast Asia? To get to, this in many ways is the starting point of the project. But before getting to what is Southeast Asia, maybe we will just look at where is Southeast Asia. So, yeah. So it's this area kind of below China and India, sort of a block of highlands, plateaus coming off from the Himalayas, block us from these two great civilizations. And at the bottom of Southeast Asia, we have Indonesia and its archipelagos. So that also creates a frame. So we are framed on top in the north by mountains and in the south by seas and this archipelagic landscape. So the question with Southeast Asia essentially is, what constitutes the unity of Southeast Asia, which is a region never unified by a single religion, language, or political system? So for anyone who knows Southeast Asia, it is extremely heterogeneous. So it's a kind of a starting question. The question for me was always, what makes it one when there are so much obvious kind of multiples in this region? But after some time, I also realized that perhaps this needs a slight correction, because for a brief moment in time, I would say nearly the whole region was unified, I would say for maybe 3 years. During the Japanese occupation, and I would say that the Japanese kind of came closest to unifying this heterogeneous region. So I found it very interesting that my work was in the calligraphy square, and there were all these other works that was dealing with the Japanese occupation. For example, Antariksa's work dealing with the Japanese effects of the Japanese occupation in Indonesia. The term Southeast Asia itself emerged, I think, in the early 1930s, late 1930s. But it really kind of consolidated close to the end of the war in 1943 with the establishing of the Southeast Asian Command by the Allied forces. So the term Southeast Asia really started to circulate widely after the establishment of these military kind of command units. So in many ways, Southeast Asia was born, as a region, was kind of born out of the war. So now I'll jump straight into R for resonance. But to get there, I first have to, I will take you through all the letters in the alphabet that makes up the dictionary. I've done this presentation a few times, and I must admit I've never made it from A to Z. So let's see how far we get today. The aim is to reach R at least. So so I will be quite quick and fast on some of these terms. The first terms that are gathered under A is A for altitude, A for attitudes, A for anarchism, and A for archipelagos. So as I mentioned earlier, we were framed in the north. The region is framed in the north by these highlands. A recent term that has been circulating is the term zomia, which describes this large highland, which is the size of Europe, essentially, which cuts across 7 different countries and has never been dominated by a single state power. So many tribes live on it, which sort of anarchic tribes that are not organized according to states sort of structures. And in the south, of course, we have the archipelagos. So I'm also thinking about altitudes, like high altitudes and very low altitudes as these spaces of anarchism. So these are images that are kind of taken out from my virtual reality work that I'm presenting here. So under B, we have B for bamboo. So bamboo can be found throughout the region. And traditionally, musical instruments from Southeast Asia, a lot of it was made with bamboo. Bamboo is cheap and easy to manipulate. It is also hollow, so it lends itself to being made, to be used as musical instruments. The only problem with bamboo is that it decays very quickly. And I'm also thinking about Kit Lat's bamboo camera that he was showing us earlier. So the next, so these are some examples of instruments made out of bamboo. The other major group of sort of ancient Southeast Asian instruments is made out of bronze. So it immediately creates an opposition because bronze persists in the humid weather in Southeast Asia. But in order to make bronze instruments, you need a lot of manpower. So bronze instruments became the instruments of the elite. So B for bamboo and B for bronze. But under C, we have C for casting and C for copper. So you need copper in order to create bronze. So that was kind of, these were instruments that were circulated in Southeast Asia during our Bronze and Iron Age. But I'm also fascinated by the process of casting. Casting is the process by which something fluid is mixed, settles into something static. So that's kind of an important concept for me in thinking about the history of gongs in Southeast Asia. Oops. Okay, so this is one of the earliest bronze instruments. It's called the Dongsun Drum. So this, in many ways, is kind of a precursor to the gongs. This again is copper. So C is for copper, but C for me is also C for corruption. You know, Southeast Asia has often, many countries in Southeast Asia rank very highly on the corruption index. And I'm thinking about this process of corruption sort of in relation to this stratification that comes together, let's say, with this process of making bronze instruments. And under D, we have decay. So I spoke very briefly earlier about decay. For me, decay is kind of the opposite of casting. If casting makes something, transforms the fluid into a solid, decay sort of disaggregates. It releases the solid into something fluid. And the next term we have is E for evasion. So just thinking about modes of evading these kinds of centralized state command and control. And the next term that we have in the dictionary is F for forest. So very often to evade the states, one could either go into the highlands or escape into the archipelagos where it's hard to track, where one can escape state surveillance, or one could also kind of hide in the forest. So the forest in Southeast Asia is kind of the shelter for myths, magic, guerrillas, bandits. And the forest presents a good shelter because it creates friction of geography. It becomes difficult for the state army to move through these landscapes. And under G, we have G, of course, for gongs. So this is a flat gong. And there are two different types of gongs. One is flat, and the other is the knobbed gong. So in my work, we kind of see a knob emerging out of the flat gong. Once you have a knob on the gong, it actually focuses the pitch of the gong. And according to many musicologists, this knob gong was an invention of Southeast Asia, probably in what is presently Thailand. Oops. So under H, we have humidity. So I've spoken a little bit about humidity and its kind of effects on creating or intensifying the rates of decay. So Southeast Asia has often been described as a world of water. So under H, other than humidity, we also have hydraulics. For me, power in Southeast Asia often has to do with control of water. For example, controlling irrigation that goes into creation of paddy fields. I will speak more about this later. And H for hydrography. So hydrography as a way of tracking movement, dispersion of genes, dispersion of goods and ideas and memes and languages by water. So much of history of early Southeast Asia for me is a kind of hydrographical history. And next, I would like to think about hydrology, which thinks about water in a different way, water as a transformation. So water as a transformation of states, like from the gaseous into the liquid. So, which is why we are seeing all these air conditioning units here. So Singapore, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, for example, Lee Kuan Yew, he's very famous for insisting that air conditioning in his office is at exactly 24 degrees. So with hydrology, I start thinking about a specific new form of control, the control of air and temperature. I have to speed up now. So under I, we have I for irrigation. So I spoke a little bit about this in terms of hydraulics. So the creation of paddy fields requires irrigation. And paddy fields, of course, means a permanent kind of settlement. So not only is rice planted, but people are planted as well, which makes them taxable and conscriptable by the states. So J for jellyfish, I think I will skip this for now so that we can reach R. Yes. And K for kinship, and kingship, also thinking about the relationship between these two terms. And again, I will skip this. L for layering, I will speak a little bit about this. Much of gong-related music in Southeast Asia is actually constructed as layers of sound. It's not really fixed as a score, but the different musical players play almost kind of their own tunes, which are sort of semi-improvised. And all of this stack up in layers. So when you listen to a lot of gong music, you can kind of perceive the interaction between different layers. But I also like to think about layers in terms of layers of histories in Southeast Asia. So traditionally, war in Southeast Asia is never extreme, like no civilizations were kind of wiped out. Rather, new civilizations and cultures built on top of one another, so everything is kind of in layers. M for mandalas. This comes from a term in describing ancient Southeast Asian empires, which are very different from the nation state. The nation state is defined by borders, but the mandala empires of Southeast Asia are defined by the center. So theoretically, every center, the king in the center, his power is infinite, it reaches, there's no end to where his power reaches. And much of these old ancient architectures in Southeast Asia, this is actually the Borobudur from Indonesia. We are looking at it from the top view. They are constructed as physical three-dimensional mandalas. And next, I have N, and N for nation, which is the opposite of the mandala, and N for narcosis. So I will skip talking about narcosis for now. And O for onomatopoeia. So just to explain very quickly, many of the musical instruments in Southeast Asia are named by the way they sound. So what we see on the left is a bamboo instrument called the angklong. And the sound that the angklong produces is pretty much like an angklong, you know, and of course we have the gong, and the name of the gong reproduces the sound of the object. So under O, we have opium, and the opium trade in the early, in the 19th century, opium was kind of grown in India and shipped to the Chinese, but it has to pass through Southeast Asia. And in Singapore, for example, a lot of opium was processed. So we move to paddy. So with paddy or rice terraces, I've spoken a little bit about this in I for irrigation, and we are reaching soon R. But now we have Q for question, quotation, and queen. I think I will pass this so that we can reach R. So R first, R for reason, and R for resonance. So we could also say R for region. And for me, this is a kind of an ideal of a region, of how to think regionally without reason. For me, reason, I would attribute it to, let's say, the Enlightenment form of reason, where everything is kind of laid out analytically. And to think about a region through reason, for me, is always to establish a kind of hierarchy, We see this in the Japanese instance of the co-prosperity sphere that they wanted to build in Asia, the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. Whenever you think regionally in the past, there's always a leader that is controlling the region, and I think we still see it today. But for me, an ideal of a dream of a region is a region that is not bounded by reason, but by these vibrations or by resonance. So maybe I think I will just stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Nguyen. Let me offer a little bit of comments on this, and then we'll move on to Tuan. So one way for me of what Zhu's doing is like thinking through Southeast Asia by this assembly, right, of the critical dictionary, which is kind of a list of terms. And in some ways, also in your presentation a little bit later, you'll also be working through some terms. So what's very interesting that connects the two of you, even though there's this kind of disconnect as well, so thus the resonance and the dissonance, is this thinking through terms. Now, it was at lunchtime, so I'm not going to name this other person, not to embarrass them, but so a friend of ours, gets a little bit of food for lunch, and they're the quiches, so they're the oblong shapes and a square, right? So she said, three oblongs and a square, and I said, well, 3 sort of savory and 1 sort of sweet. So then I blamed you for this, because one of the things that I start seeing happening is that these terms are laid out, and you start looking for patterns. You start looking for things, are they oppositional? And it's almost like these kinds of building blocks of how our narratives come about. And, as if you were like performing resonance with this articulation of a list of terms. So in their presentation, there's a certain kind of repetition and everything like that, but all of a sudden, I think things go awry. And for me, that's the part of the pleasure, and also how it's troubling. So there seems to be a certain kind of lightness to it, but I do feel that there's this spirit of troubling. On that note, then, I'm going to hand over to Tuan.
Hello. The French forced you to wage this unjust war. You have nothing to win from it. On the contrary, Moroccan, Tunisian, Algerian blood was spilled to the benefit of the colonialist oppressors of the Moroccan people, as well as the Vietnamese people. Lower your weapons. Don't persist in this useless struggle. Hooray for the friendship of the Moroccan and the Vietnamese people. So I wanted to tell a story about my search for solidarity, especially solidarities that happened on the battlefield as wars were waged. I just read from a leaflet that was distributed by the Viet Minh, the communist forces of North Vietnam, during the French Indochina War, to appeal to a sense of common oppression towards colonial soldiers of the French army. This call for solidarity continued into the Vietnam War, aimed at African American soldiers that were taking part in the US military. In my research, I kept hearing whispers of stories here and there of soldiers defecting, colonial soldiers, defecting and joining the revolutionary fighters, the Vietnamese revolutionary fighters in solidarity. But there's actually very, very little research and even less documentation that these events actually took place. So the story of solidarity that I will be able to tell today is the story of solidarity that I found amongst the friendships that I made during the projects that I've presented for the biennial this year. And amongst those stories of shared amongst these friendships that I made, there is one particular story. Oh, sorry, I'm totally forgetting to click the clicker. This is an image of General Zapp talking to captured prisoners of war, colonial soldiers, during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And these images kind of conjure in my imaginations like these amazing discussions of coloniality, solidarity, but of course, you know, it ends as only an image on a postcard sold in the North. So amongst the many, many stories that I was able to kind of experience on my journey to making this project, there's one particular story that I found remarkably poignant and reflective of a very specific moment of erasure, both politically and historically, and even personally, that my friend Makadu Njai tells. And he tells the story of his own life. It's a story of losing himself and rebuilding himself. My friend Makadu is 62 years old this year. He's going to be 63 in a couple weeks. He's a lawyer with a practice in TS, Senegal. He follows in the footsteps of his father, Ibrahima Njai, who was also a lawyer. But before Ibrahima Njai became a lawyer, he was a soldier in the French army. This happened very often amongst young men in West Africa during that time. And I'd like to introduce you. I'm just going to jump straight to T, and I'm skip A. And there's a term that I became very familiar with, a term that I had lots of problems pronouncing in the beginning of the project, tirailleur. France began to make use of their colonial subjects in North and West Africa as a military resource in the 19th century. Tirailleur means light infantry or rifleman. It becomes a general term for colonial soldier. And tirailleur sénégalais was a term used to not only speak of Senegalese riflemen, colonial soldiers, but it became a general term for all of the colonial soldiers of West Africa. And this includes Mauritania, Senegal, of course, French Sudan, which is now Mali, French Guinea, Ivory Coast, Upper Volta, which is now Burkina Faso, Dahomey, now is Benin and Niger. And these soldiers were originally used to kind of further local conquest and maintain like French colonial order within the region. This is an image of a Indochinois, tirailleur Indochinois and a tirailleur Magassi here. Because the French, after the success of their original tirailleur in Senegal, they realized that they saved a lot of money and a lot of bodies by using colonial soldiers. And they started recruiting colonial soldiers everywhere. Then they started to realize that these colonial soldiers could fight their own wars. So in World War I, France recruited almost 200,000 tirailleurs Senegalese from West Africa to fight on the battlefields of Europe. And almost 100,000 Indo-Chinese tirailleurs were sent from Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, to Europe to fight. And so for me, this imagination of like these colonial soldiers fighting side by side start to kind of appear in my head. Yeah, and I'll just give you some more numbers. So in total, estimates vary to close to 1 million men supplied by France's colonies for World War I. Skip this. So this is an image of colonial soldiers, prisoners of war, caught by the imprisoned, and you can see that you have Senegalese, Guinea, Somali, Tunisia, Annam, which is Indochina, Sudan, and Dahomey here. And this usage of tirailleur continued into World War II. Suddenly, when Vietnam started to kind of fight and have a revolution against the colonial empire, the French colonial empire, the French sent many of their Senegalese tirailleurs to Indochina to squash the revolution. This is an image from some archival footage we found in the military archives of France. So the French sent about 60,000 African soldiers to Indochina. And we all know at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which Frantz Fanon calls the beginning of the end of the French Empire, France begins to withdraw all their tirailleurs. And then they realize there's a problem here. Because many of their soldiers, French, and colonial French, of course, had relationships with many of the native women, and they had many, many children. So in the early 70s, Makadu, my friend Makadu Njai, he's in his early 20s, and he's getting ready for law school. He's at home alone one day, and he starts going through his dad's stuff. And he discovers photos of his father's time in Europe and in Indochina as a soldier. And then he finds a letter sent to his father by a woman named Nguyen. And Nguyen talks about a child also named Makadu. Makadu Njai, my friend, thought that his father had another child by the same name. This happens a lot in Senegal, so I hear, where people name their children as a namesake after other children that they might have had. But very soon after, Makadu realizes that the child in the photo being held by the Vietnamese woman was himself. So this moment kind of defined, or rather redefined his life, challenged his notions of identity, community, politics, military culture, so on and so forth. So I can say possibly it was a moment of cognitive dissonance. The concept of memory to him was completely destabilized. Whose memory had he been living? What memory? How? Why? Makadu grew up for almost 20 years not knowing he was Métis. This is another term that I became very familiar with as I began my research. It's a very colloquial French term to talk about someone whose parents have different backgrounds, geographical or cultural backgrounds. It was a term popularized during the colonial period in France to refer to children of the European colonials and of native women, particularly. There's been some writing about how Métis, the children of French colonials and native women, threatened the ideas of purity in the colonial order. There's a particular book called Empire's Children that I'll refer to by Emmanuel Sada, who maps out the issue that she calls as the Métis question. So the French administration had to spend over 60 years to apply techniques of social engineering to reclassify the Métis as part of French society, because it was creating an upheaval in terms of identity and nationality and these ideas of nationalism. But even the Métis that Sada notes as confusing the neat division between colonizers and the colonized is a Métis born of white French colonials, French soldiers, government officials, and native women. There's rarely been studies, writings about a métissage between the colonized. I find this particularly interesting, but I'm going to play a video as I'd like to hear some of the members of the Senegalese Vietnamese community talk about this idea of métissage.
J'ai plutôt une éducation plus africaine que vietnamienne. C'est ce que je pense, je ne sais pas. Je ne sais pas comment les Vietnamiens, comme lui, comme Tuan, comment il me prend. Puisque, comme lui, il me voit avec des yeux de Vietnamien, moi, je me vois avec des yeux de Sénégalaise, vietnamienne. Je ne sais pas comment il me prend.
Alors, les Vietnamiens, ils ont eu une parole pour se ficher de nous. Taylai, métis, incroyable qu'à voir. Ils mangent les patates avec la peau. Taylai, incroyable qu'à voir. Un choc, alors, ils mangent le chien avec les poils. et ils mangent des kakis avec les noyaux. Les kakis.
Moi, j'ai vécu pendant 19 ans, je ne savais même pas que j'étais métisse.
Et ce n'est qu'en 88, lors du décès de mes parents, que j'ai su que j'ai été adoptée. C'est mon institutrice des années 58, Madame Isabelle Hénard Amin, qui a expliqué mon histoire, comme quoi j'ai été une enfant trouvée pendant la guerre de Dien-Bien-Phu, après le champ de bataille.
Ah ben, nous, des Minfou, c'est une défaite. Hein. Moi, j'étais français, donc je raisonnais en français. C'est terrible, mais c'est vrai. J'avais le choix entre le Vietnam et la France.
Je me considère vietnamienne. C'est ma particularité, c'est ma fierté. Hein. Je ne vois pas pourquoi je vais me métamorphoser en française ou en sénégalaise.
Et là, qu'est-ce que je ressemble? Métis un peu, non? Sénégalais, oui. Noir, quoi. Oui.
On est toujours le métis de quelqu'un, de quelque chose, parce que ici vous allez voir traditionnellement un serrère qui va se marier à une Peul. Ça, c'est un métissage entre Africains, parce que c'est deux différentes ethnies qui se marient. Et nous, on va dire que c'est le métissage international, parce que c'est l'Afrique et l'Asie.
Non, mais bon, le racisme, bon, il existe partout. Où est-ce qu'il est inquiétant? Il faudrait savoir à quel niveau. Moi, je suppose que j'ai dû subir du racisme aussi.
Donc, a retiré son fils en lui disant « il faut te méfier de lui ». Parce que lui, il est caractériel. Et de temps en temps, quand son sang saïgonais bout en lui, on ne peut pas le retenir.
Je me sens vietnamien, malgré que mon père génétique est sénégalais. Mais je refuse cette nationalité, car mon père a abandonné ma mère avec 8 enfants.
La famille de mon père, pendant un certain temps, en fait, n'ont jamais voulu d'elle. Parce que justement, ils l'ont toujours traitée d'étrangère. Et même nous, quand nous sommes venus au monde, les propres parents de mon père, en fait, nous regardaient plutôt de haut. Parce qu'on se disait, mais quel genre de personnes sont les enfants les enfants de mon père. Bon, parce que le métissage était assez prononcé.
Tout comme ils ont cherché à effacer les traces du métissage à la fin de la guerre, parce qu'ils considéraient que, par exemple, le métissage noir était une tâche chez eux.
Parce que là-bas, il y a plein de guerres. Et voilà, tu es tout le métis. Hein? Si tu ne prends pas l'enfant venu, il va te tuer. Il y a beaucoup comme ça, ils sont tués.
We work closely with an organization in Dakar called Kim Hoi, which in Vietnamese means Golden Union. There's actually many organizations that are Senegalese Vietnamese organizations scattered around Senegal, but this is an organization that probably has the most members and is most organized. And it's interesting because the organization was actually born from the second generation children of the first generation of Vietnamese mothers that migrated to Senegal. And they started to realize that they were only getting together at funerals because all the Vietnamese mothers were starting to pass away. So in order to sustain some sort of memory of their mothers and of that community that had kind of organically took shape in the 40s and 50s, they created this organization here. This is an image of one of their conferences, I think last year. So there are no concrete numbers of how many Vietnamese women actually migrated to Senegal in the 40s and 50s with their Senegalese husbands, soldiers. Some people in the community that we talk to estimate maybe in the 100, like 100 or 200. But from our research, I would estimate much higher. I would estimate close to 1,000. The children brought back or sent back, or rather sent to Senegal, probably range in the thousands. And this includes children that were half like Métis, Senegalese, Vietnamese Métis. There were also children that were full Vietnamese that were just taken by Senegalese soldiers, like Lily, who just spoke in the previous video. Yeah, so it's a very complicated kind of history. But this idea of mother is a very kind of interesting one in relationship to memory. Mother equates to memory for this community. So let me play this video as these members of the community talk about this idea of memory.
Beaucoup ont souffert et je me suis dit que de toute façon elles auraient leur place dans l'histoire parce que c'est l'histoire d'une guerre et des séquelles d'une guerre. Mais qui pourrait dire leurs émotions? Dans l'histoire, elles seraient apparues anonymement.
Et ces femmes vietnamiennes qui, elles, ont subi l'histoire de la colonisation, d'accord? Elles, une fois qu'elles ont quitté le Vietnam, on les oublie.
Could we turn on the volume? Turn the volume up a little bit.
Le nom de ma mère ne sortira d'aucune autre bouche, sinon de la mienne. Je me dis non, ça ne va pas se passer comme ça.
Il y a la maman de Marie Tiwa, il y a Madame Gomis, il y a Madame Diallo, la maman de Bouba Diallo, il y a la famille Correa, il y a Bajaki, la maman de Jean-Claude Do. Elles sont peut-être une centaine.
Il y aura toujours une transmission, mais je veux dire, c'est toujours à la personne, c'est-à-dire à la maman ou à la personne qui est métissée, de faire en sorte que cette transmission se fasse.
Bon, discuter, ce n'était pas tous les jours. Mais il nous arrivait de s'asseoir, qu'on s'assied et qu'on discute. Voilà, de son passé, de trucs. Bon, je peux avoir oublié certaines choses, mais bon, il y a certaines choses que j'ai retenues aussi.
Voilà, et je ne pense pas que mon père me prenne un jour sur ses genoux en me disant « c'est comme ça que j'ai rencontré ta maman » ou ceci ou cela, ça c'est...
Et quand elle était en veine de confidence, voilà, elle nous faisait ce genre de confidence, mais après, elle se taisait.
Ben, c'est-à-dire que le Vietnam, pour moi, c'est quoi? C'est un pays, c'est le pays de ma mère d'abord.
Không có tin tức gì nữa. Bây giờ đi đâu kiếm ai giờ? Bây giờ mình già rồi đi đâu được nữa. Hồi đó mong chở muốn đi, không có tiền. Giờ đó đâu có đi gì được.
Ça peut s'effacer complètement.
Nous sommes une vraie tribu, mais seulement un peu éparpillée. Ouais. Mais je suis heureux d'être le fils de ce dernier Mohican. Elle est ma mère, je l'aime beaucoup, de tout mon cœur. Et je ne souhaiterais pas qu'elle meure un jour, mais qu'elle vive éternellement. Que je puisse poser les yeux tous les jours sur elle. Et que, si Dieu le veut, qu'elle retrouve sa jeunesse. Et qu'elle vive heureuse, au lieu d'avoir souffert comme elle a souffert, au Vietnam déjà, et au Sénégal. Ses souffrances au Sénégal ont été énormes. Et moi, je suis compatissant envers elle. Si je peux lui éliminer toutes ses souffrances, je les effacerai complètement de sa mémoire.
So, the specter of ancestors becoming, it was a collective effort. I imagine, and I consider it a collaborative film. People from the Senegalese Vietnamese community in Dakar and Malika contributed in their own ways to the film. A big part of the film were 3 scenes written by 3 people, 3 writers. And these scenes are fictional dialogues based on very loose memories of what happened. These scenes kind of give agency to these characters in conversations that never took place. So for Anne-Marie Nyen, she reimagines her mother and her father in Saigon discussing that they have to leave. Of course, her mother never had a voice, so she gives her mother a voice in the scene that she rewrites. Makadu Njai writes a scene about where he confronts his father about his history. This never happened. There was silence throughout his whole life about his origins. And Mary Bay, who was a third-generation Senegalese Vietnamese, she writes a scene where she discusses, in very abstract and poetic form, ideas of future and memory with her grandmother. So Spectre of Ancestors Becoming is not about reenactment. In some ways, it's not about history. For me, it's really about the creation of memory and the agency that lies within that. In my discussions with a lot of the people in the community, we kind of see it as an offering to the ancestors from a community that finds agency in the ways that they've come to embody these inherited narratives. And I'll leave with one last clip by Anne-Marie Nyen, who kind of sums it up quite beautifully.
En fait, c'est un peu reconstruire l'histoire. Parce que là où la mémoire ne joue plus, l'imagination fait le reste. Et c'est important quelquefois de rebâtir une histoire, parce qu'on peut se reconstruire en rebâtissant une histoire.
One of the things that surprises me listening to the presentations is, at first I liked the pairing very much because I was thinking about the resonant and the dissonant, but there's another aspect of it that I had been thinking about more in terms of your practice than let me put that, not just practice but research, right? In terms of your research, and now as becoming apparent, is the speculative and how of course, war is how we think of history, but as you just said, you were really thinking about memory, and memory is so much more complicated. Going back to you, Nguyen, in the ways that you were talking about how resonance has that kind of speculative dimension. It's not just about what brings us together through reason, but how we can imagine. And that's really tied in very much with, especially the last things that you articulated about the stories that were written about a mother, confronting her Senegalese husband, the conversation that she couldn't get to have, the son who couldn't have that conversation with his father. I don't know if this is appropriate, but I'd like to share something very personal. I am embarrassed to say I don't remember my grandfather's name, but now you've given a name to him. He was a tirailleur. I didn't realize that word applied to my grandfather. Just now I realized that. And my grandmother is Métis, but I never met her, and I never knew her name. So that was I was having this very, very personal moment when you were explaining that, how a million colonials were fighting for the First World War, and one of them is my grandfather. I don't know if you guys have any questions for each other.
I was proposing to Weng that maybe me and Nyen sing as a kind of metaphoric resonance, dissonance kind of exercise, but maybe we'll leave that for later. I'm just joking.
I think that's our cue to leave. Get up and leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you.